Thank you so much. What a great honor to be here with you today. I want to congratulate all of you graduates for your remarkable accomplishment, achieving this milestone, earning the credit, meeting the requirements for this degree of law is something that is quite noteworthy, and I'm really proud to share this moment with you. But I hope today that you'll see this degree that you receive as not just an academic achievement, not just something that you can hang on the wall. Because I believe people who are trained in the law, who are motivated to pursue law, must also be motivated to pursue justice. I think a law degree isn't just a piece of paper. It's not just an academic degree. It is an invitation to use your voices, your minds, your lives to change the world, to create more justice. We're living at a time when there's this rising fear and anger and anguish. There is tremendous inequality in the world. There's tremendous injustice in the world. There's a great need for a community of people to be champions of justice. And today, I hope you'll join the community of us who believe that we have an obligation to create more justice, to create more equality, to create more opportunity. In my country, I've seen the consequences of what happens when too few answer the call. In the United States, we had 300,000 people in jails and prisons in 1972. Today, we have 2.3 million people in jails and prisons. America has become the nation with the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We've got 6 million people on probation or parole. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrest. We've seen this horrific increase in the numbers of women being sent to jails and prisons, 70% of whom are single parents with minor children, which means that when these moms go to jails and prisons, the lives of their children are displaced. I know what happens when there isn't a commitment to the rule of law. I'm a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I started my education in a colored school. When I was a little boy, they did not permit black children to attend the public schools. There were no high schools. In the county where I grew up, when my dad was a teenager, he couldn't go to high school. And then lawyers came into our community and made them open up the public schools. And that commitment to the rule of law is the only reason why I'm standing here. Lawyers came into my community where poor black children ran around and made it possible for them to move forward. And we need more lawyers to replicate that intervention. There are 4 things I want to share to you. I think we can change the world. I think each of us, no matter what our area of interest, can do it. But there are some things we have to do. The first thing I am persuaded we have to do is we're going to have to find ways when we leave this university, when we leave this great institution, to not isolate ourselves and the various opportunities that will be presented to us. We're going to have to find ways to get proximate to those who are suffering, to the poor, the excluded, the neglected, the marginalized. I'm actually persuaded that our education has to continue in proximity to those who are suffering. In proximity to those who've been excluded and neglected. There is something you learn in proximity that you cannot learn from a distance. And there is some power there waiting for us. And it can't just be on the campuses. It just can't be in the places that are esteemed and respected. Many of you have been taught that no matter where you live, if there's a bad part of town, stay as far away from the bad part of town as possible. Today, I'm going to argue the opposite. I believe that law graduates from this university need to get closer to the people living in the bad parts of town, and the places in our country when they're suffering in despair. And there is something waiting for this. I learned about proximity not from my study of the law, not from my career. I actually learned about it from my grandmother. I had one of those amazing grandmothers. My grandmother was the classic African-American matriarch. She was tough, she was strong, she was the daughter of people who were enslaved, and she was a real force in our family. My grandmother was actually the end of every argument in our family. She was also the start of a lot of arguments in our family. And when I was a little boy, my grandmother would do these things I didn't quite understand. When I was about 9 or 10, she would come up to me and she'd give me these hugs, and she would squeeze me so tightly, I thought she was trying to hurt me. And then she'd see me an hour later and she'd say, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she would jump on me again. So by the time I was 10, my grandmother had trained me. Every time I would see her, the first thing I would always say is, "Mama, I always feel you hugging me." And she'd smile this smile, and I didn't know what she was doing until I was much older in my life. My grandmother worked as a domestic her whole life, and when she got into her 90s, she fell, she broke her hip, she developed cancer, and she was dying. And I went to see my grandmother on her deathbed, and she was lying there, and my heart was broken because I loved her so much. And her eyes were closed, and I was just pouring my heart out, and I couldn't really make sense of what was going on. I just was grieving. And after I'd said everything I was supposed to say, I stood up to leave. I didn't think my grandmother could even hear me. And I was holding her hands, but as I moved to leave, my grandmother opened her eyes. She squeezed my hand. And the last thing she said to me, she said, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And then she said, "I'm always going to be hugging you." And when we position ourselves of great stress and conflict, when we position ourselves in places where there's fear and anger, where there's distrust, where there's anxiety, we can at least embrace those who stand next to us. And I don't think there's anything inconsistent with the law degrees that you have received. We're getting close enough to people to wrap your arms around them, to affirm their humanity and their dignity. We can change the world when we get proximate. The second thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to change the narratives that are threats to the rule of law. I want to argue that there is this dynamic in every country on the planet. And that dynamic is defined by what I call the politics of fear and anger. There are people who will preach fear and anger. They're going to try to persuade citizens and communities to be governed by their fear and their anger, not by the law. And fear and anger are the essential ingredients of injustice and inequality. And if we allow the politics of fear and anger to triumph, we will see the kind of mob violence that we're commemorating at our memorial. You'll see this retreat. We'll tolerate inequality, we'll tolerate injustice, and there have to be lawyers, advocates, people who stand up for the rule of law, even as we're dealing with that. That narrative is key to our capacity to change the world. Changing narratives is critical to how we make a difference. The third thing I'm persuaded you're going to have to do is you're going to have to stay hopeful. Hopelessness is the enemy of justice. And if you're not careful, the complexity of the world around you will make you begin to believe that you can't actually do the things that motivated you to come to this institution, that motivated you to study law. If you're not careful, the size of the problem, the enormity, the complexity of the issues will make you think you can't make a difference, and you're going to have to fight that. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And you have to find ways to fight against the things that make you hopeless. Your hope is your superpower. It is hope that will sometimes get some of you to stand up when others say sit down. It's hope that will get some of you to speak when others say be quiet, and your voice and your witness is the thing that will allow the world to change. And finally, to change the world, to create more justice, we're going to have to do something really hard. We're going to have to do things sometimes that are uncomfortable and inconvenient. And I hate saying that because we're human. And humans are programmed to do what's comfortable. We like the things that are convenient. It's just biologically and psychologically the way we're wired. But to change the world, we're going to have to be willing to do uncomfortable things, inconvenient things. And I wish it weren't like this. I tried to do some research on this one. I looked for some examples where justice prevailed, where equality triumphed, where liberty was won, and no one had to do anything inconvenient or uncomfortable. I can't find any examples of that. It only happens when good people are willing to position themselves in difficult places. I learned about this from a man. I was giving a talk in a church one day, and this older black man came into the back of the church. He was in a wheelchair. And as I was talking, this older man was staring at me, had this stern, angry look on his face the whole time I was giving my talk. And I couldn't figure out, why is he looking at me so sternly, so angrily? And I got through my talk, and people came up. They were very nice and appropriate. But that older man sitting in the back in his wheelchair just kept staring, looking at me angrily. And finally, when everybody else left, this older man wheeled himself to the front of the church. And when he got in front of me, he put his hand up and he looked at me and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I just stood there. And then the man asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I stepped back and I mumbled something. I don't even remember what I said. Then he asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And then this older man looked at me and he said, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And this man looked at me and he said, "You're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice." I was very moved. I was also really relieved because I just didn't know what he was about to do. Then this man grabbed me by my jacket and he pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, "Come here, come here, come here." I said, "I'm going to show you something." And then this older man turned his head. And on the right side of his neck, he had this scar. He said, "You see this scar?" He said, "I got this scar in Alabama in 1963 protesting for the right to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this cut I have down here at the bottom of my neck?" He said, "I got that cut in Mississippi in 1964 protesting for the right to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, protesting for the right to vote." Then he looked at me. He said, "I'm going to tell you something, young man." He said, "People look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These are not my cuts." He said, "These are not my bruises. These are not my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." And I believe when people committed to justice, when people committed to equality, when people committed to changing the world, use the degrees that you receive today, and they get proximate, and they change narratives, and they stay hopeful, and they do uncomfortable things, those people turn a law degree into a medal of honor. I believe really simple things. I believe that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. That's why I do the work I do. I believe that if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think someone who takes something isn't just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer, and justice requires that we know the other things you are. I'm not persuaded that the opposite of poverty is wealth. Bristol's a beautiful community. This country is a glorious space. And I see the wealth and I see the progress, but I am persuaded that the opposite of poverty isn't wealth. When I come to Bristol, when I come to the UK, when I come to Europe, when I go anywhere in the world, what I am absolutely persuaded of is that the opposite of poverty isn't wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we do justice, we deconstruct the conditions that give rise to poverty. And finally, I believe that your lives, your careers, our system of justice, our community, our nation can't be judged by how well we treat the powerful, the rich, and the privileged. I believe we will be judged by how we treat the poor, the neglected, the abandoned, and the vulnerable. And with that in mind, I'm excited for what you all represent, for what you have all achieved, for what you can all do to change the world. It is a glorious honor for me to be here with you today, because I know that many of you are going to find ways to get proximate, to change these narratives, to stay hopeful, and to do uncomfortable things that change the world. For that, I want to celebrate you. I want to congratulate you, and I want to thank you. Thank you all very, very much.